and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenna and I read a lot of books. I am making this video in response to myself. So I recently requested that a librarian give me recommendations based on books that I had loved. And I gave a list of those books, and one of them happened to be Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne. I absolutely loved this book. I adored this book. I thought this book was quirky and funny and had depth, and the characters were believable, tropey, but enjoyable, laugh out loud funny, really endearing. I enjoyed it a lot. And I was recommended to read in response Evvie Drake Starts Over by Linda Holmes. And this book was nothing like this book. Where this book is funny and quirky and light and character driven and endearing, this book is over anxious, incredibly serious. 90% of the interactions between the two possible love interests are pretty harsh calling out of each other, to the point where it feels like that's the only kind of interaction they have. And yeah, I just felt like this was a completely different entity. And I don't really understand why it was recommended to me based on my statements that I loved Second First Impressions. So I went through my shelves and I pulled all of the books that I would consider to be romance that I could find readily. These are not all the romances that I've ever read and loved. But all the books that I pulled all the books that I think are romance books, that I would categorize as romance books, that I really, really love. And there are so many of them, and they are really varied. And so I just want to put it out there that if you love Second First Impressions, you might love some of these, because I do. So here we go. I'm going to start with two books by the same author, although they are not companion pieces really. They are standalones, but they read well together. And that is Louise Miller. Those books are The City Baker's Guide to Country Living and The Late Bloomers Club. Both of these books are absolutely delightful. I cannot wait for another Louise Miller book to come into the world. Louise Miller is an author, but she is also a baker. She lives in the Boston area, and her Instagram is divine. If you like plants, if you like baked goods, if you like creativity, if you like books, if you like nature, birds, you want to follow her on Instagram. She's amazing, but she's also an amazing author. And I would highly recommend either of these books as great romance novels for if you enjoy Sally Thorne's Second First Impressions. The next two are also by the same author. They are kind of from a series in that they both retell a classic fairy tale, but they set them in the modern era, and they're older books. And this author, as far as I know, has another series with a very particular character, and some YA books, but doesn't have any more in this particular series that I really loved back in the day. This is Sarah Strohmeyer, and the two books I love by Sarah Strohmeyer are The Sleeping Beauty Proposal and The Cinderella Pact. The Cinderella Pact was made into a made-for-TV movie, which is pretty fun, but nothing as great as this book. These two are really wonderful. They feature, one of them features a plus-size heroine. They both follow just that regular, expected formula for a romance. The meet-cutes are adorable, and the characters feel like real people. So I highly recommend both of those if you love a quirky, fun romance. Next is one that kind of deviates from my norm, and that is the 3-book series, the trilogy, The Cousins O'Dwyer by Nora Roberts. This is just the first book. I have the other 2 on my shelf, but I just grabbed the first one. And I don't read a lot of Nora Roberts at all. I know that there's like Roberts readathons and all sorts of things that happen throughout the year. I'm not into any of those. In fact, most of the time when I pick up a Nora Roberts, I do not like her. But there was a time in college when I was kind of just reading names that I'd heard about, and most of those names were on like the New York Times bestseller lists. So I read some Dan Brown, and I read some Nora Roberts, and I read like names that I definitely probably wouldn't pick up today, but they were names that were familiar, therefore I thought, oh, I probably would like those books. Other people like them, so I probably will too. I didn't know a lot about myself as a reader at that time, but I'm glad because I ended up finding this trilogy, the Nora Roberts Cousins O'Dwyer trilogy, which is about, it's dual timeline, and it's about a family legacy which has to do with witchcraft and kind of a fish out of water and I'm different than everybody else. I know people hate that trope. I don't mind it because I am different from everyone else. No. But yeah, it's really fun. It's super cheesy. It's not the greatest writing in the world. The conversation feels stilted, but at the same time, I reread these like every couple of years. A, because they're super familiar. B, because I love a good witch story. And C, because there's something really quirky and weird and endearing about how kind of awful these are. I love to, well, I don't hate them. I don't hate them. I just love them. I love to love them. So that's a 3-book series, which is really great. This is another one that I read back in the day. I remember really clearly my mom reading these Belva Plain books, especially this Evergreen series, also by somebody else. I don't remember who, but I also remember her reading A Woman of Substance. I don't remember who wrote those. But I grew up with my mom reading these. Eugenia Price as well, not the author of A Woman of Substance, but those names come to mind. And my mom read those. And I didn't. And I knew that they were romance novels. And I was reading Janet Oke at the time. And my mom was reading Belva Plain. And Evergreen was one that stood out to me. I think I read snippets of it or something, and I knew that it was historical fiction, and I was all about the historical fiction. So I came across a copy of this in a backpacker's hostel when I was in college, and I was like, oh, that looks really familiar to me. I'll grab that and I'll read that. And in the mountains of Tibet, in between teaching classes, I devoured this book, and I ended up leaving that copy behind. But I got this copy at a library book sale, and I think I paid like 5 cents for it, and haven't reread it since that time, but has a really special place in my heart. And I've never read the other books in this series. 1978. So it's almost a classic. I love it. I absolutely love it. If you enjoy a story like The Thornbirds or something like that, only minus the weird age gaps, etc., you might enjoy Evergreen. It's an immigrant story. This series, there are 4 books in this series. I have all of them, and I only pulled this one. All 3 of my other copies, like in this series, are hardbacks because I got them off of Book Outlet, but I couldn't find the first one. I couldn't find Winter Street anywhere, so I got this tiny little copy, but that's okay. I listened to these 3 winters ago, on audio that I got from my library, and I didn't know what I was getting into, and I fell absolutely in love with them, and I listened to all 4 of them on a binge in the month of December in 2019. And yeah, if you have not read them, I've never read another Ellen Hildebrand. I'm not really interested in reading another one. I have one on my shelf, a summary one. Maybe I'll read it. I don't know. but it was this family. It's dramatic, it's over the top, it's quirky and ridiculous. Some of the characters drive me absolutely nuts, but some of the characters I love with my whole heart. And if you want a book that's going to make you laugh and cry, this series might be the series for you, but be warned, you can't or read just one. You're gonna need them all. So just get them all to begin with. Then I love the Princess Diaries series. This is a fun romance to me. This is a quirky romance to me. And I love, again, it's that fish out of water story. It's also, I'm different from everybody else. And it's also like commoner to royalty. Maybe I do, because I also love the Selection series, which I don't have on this pile here. But maybe I do like commoner to royalty. I'll have to look at that about myself. But I love the Princess Diaries, and I will admit that I watched the Anne Hathaway movie long before I ever picked these up, and I was an adult when I picked them up and when I watched that movie, and I still love these. When I read these, I lived in India, and I read all of them at once. I got them at a Scholastic book sale, but they were the cool looking British covers. They were the larger paperback size, and they had the Mia cartoon person on the front of them, and I loved those. I left them behind in India. I couldn't bring all my stuff with me when I moved back after 5 years. Got these, picked these up for my library. The American, like, small paperback editions, and I hate them, but I love the content, so that's that. I love Sophie Kinsella. Anybody who knows this channel knows that I love Sophie Kinsella dearly. I pre-order every book that she puts out. I've already pre-ordered months and months and months ago. I pre-ordered before it had a cover or a name. I pre-ordered the one that's coming out this October, at the end of this October. Can't wait for it to get here. Here's the thing about me and Sophie Kinsella. For example, there's that wedding one. There's the one with wedding in the title. And I bought that years and years and years ago on Audible and hated it. Couldn't get into it. Couldn't listen to it. Then when I realized that you could return titles on Audible and exchange them, you'd get a credit back and exchange them. There's a limit on it, but you can do that. It was one of the first ones that I thought I would return because I'd had it for years and I'd never been able to finish it. But I decided at that time to go ahead and try and give it one more shot because I did love Sophie Kinsella. And the second time I tried it, years later, I adored it. It's one of my very favorites now. That's the thing about me and Sophie Kinsella. I have to be in the right mood for the right story. And I'm always in the mood for Shopaholic. I know some people are annoyed by Shopaholic. I don't care. Love it. Absolutely love it. Right up my alley. My favorite standalone by Sophie Kinsella is I've Got Your Number. I absolutely love the premise of this book. It makes me really laugh a lot. This idea that they're brought together by a mistake, by an accident. It's just super fun and engaging and quirky. All the things I love. All the things I love in a romance novel. I've also got One to Watch, which is a recent read for me that I really enjoyed. And I know a lot of people didn't like this one. A lot of people loved it, but a lot of people didn't like this one. And it was the perfect one for me. This was pretty near perfect for me. It was a little slow at some moments, but I really, really liked the main character. I really liked the very, very subtle, almost like fairy godmother quality of being in Paris and buying that jacket. But it's very gentle and not really part of the story. Like, I loved that. I really loved the different men, because it's kind of like The Bachelor, so in case you're unfamiliar, but I really like the different men that she encounters and how, even though we don't see them nearly as much as we see her, they're all really well developed. I did not love, the reason why it's near perfect and not perfect is because I did not love the way that there's always that moment near the end where everything falls apart before it comes together. I didn't like the way that went down. That didn't feel authentic to me. But everything else about this book was awesome. It was quirky, it was funny, it was anger-inducing, it was engaging, characters felt real most of the time, and it had qualities of like fairy tale a little bit. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. Two Steps Forward, a completely different kind of book. This is actually based on some truth Whereas one of these authors has hiked the Camino Trail, and some of this story is based on their experience. But this is like a dual kind of book. This is a romance. It's a straight up romance. Strangers in the Night kind of romance. And it's also, though, like a self-discovery romance, like learning to love yourself. I loved this. I loved everything about this. One of the things that I really loved, and that I almost always love in any book, romance or no, is a European setting. Just absolutely love European setting. It made me want to hike the Camino Trail. I don't want to hike the Camino Trail, but it made me want to hike the Camino Trail. I love L.M. Montgomery. I love Anne of Green Gables. I love Emily of New Moon even more, but this is my favorite. It's a standalone novel called The Blue Castle, about a fish out of water. Are we sensing a theme here? It's also laugh out loud funny, because you have, the premise of this is that you have a young woman who has lived by the kind of heavy-handed expectations of a very patriarchal family, and never questioned. Every time she's questioned, she's gotten knocked down, and so she's just learned to just be quiet and live with it and do things the way that she's expected to do them. But this has made her incredibly unhappy, very lonely, and she sees no real hope in the future. She feels really isolated and alone and misunderstood, and one day she goes to see a doctor. It's not a doctor that she would normally see, because the family doesn't approve of this doctor, because they always use this other doctor. And that doctor provides her, through a course of events, with some very disturbing news. That she may not live. That she will, in fact, not live for much longer. This is the key to freedom for this character, because knowing she will soon die, she decides to do life the way she would like to do life. And it's fun. It's really fun. This book is ahead of its time, and really, really engaging, and super wonderful and amazing. And it's a standalone, and it's short. I loved this. An Irish Country Girl. This is one of the, if you've been around, you know that I read these Irish Country Doctor books, one a month. Not in August, though, because I'm taking a month off. But you know that I love this series, but this book is kind of a standalone. It features the backstory of the woman who is essentially the maid, the housekeeper, the woman who keeps everything together for two doctors in the other books in the series. But in this, we get to focus in on her. Her name is I can never say it. Her name is Kinky Kincaid, and she is wonderful. But this is her childhood. It is her love story. It is her sister's love story. It is magical. It is full of Irish folklore and heartbreak and humor, and I felt every emotion very extremely as I was reading this book, and I read it so quickly. And this remains, right now I've read, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So when I pick this back up, I'll be on the 8th book. No, this would be an 8th. I'll be on the 9th book. And of those 9 that I've read so far, and still have many more to go, this remains my favorite. And it's kind of a standalone. You can read it as a standalone, or you can read it within the context of the rest of the stories like I did. But it is a phenomenal love story. Phenomenal. Tearjerker, though. You're going to want tissues. Jane Eyre. I love Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is the romance that started it all for me. I mean, all. Like, started me on literature, started me on romance, started me on Victorian literature, started me on everything. I love this book. I love this story. I am currently reading 2 retellings of it at once. Absolutely love this book. And the Brontes. Speaking of Anne the Brontes, Anne Bronte has another book that I absolutely love. Now, I didn't put Wuthering Heights on here because, yeah, it's quirky, and yeah, it's gothic, and yeah, there's ghosts and stuff. And I love it, don't get me wrong, but I don't consider it to be a romance. Are you throwing things at me right now? Don't throw that. Put that down. Put it. Don't throw that at me. Wuthering Heights is not a romance, so it's not on this stack. But we've got The Tenant of Wildville Hall by Anne Bronte, which is a romance. It's also a proto-feminist manifesto of brilliance and greatness, but ultimately it's a romance, and I love it. And that's saying a whole lot, because it's much of it is written in a very, for me, difficult style of old diaries being rediscovered by an outsider. I know that the Brontes loved to do this sort of thing, and I love them in spite of that, not because of that. I love this book, and I love these stories, and I love Anne Bronte, and I wish she hadn't done that. You know, I can still be critical of my obsessions. Ramona by Helen Hun Jackson. Helen Hun Jackson was a good friend of Emily Dickinson. She spent a lot of her time advocating for the rights of Native Americans and in the West, and many of her books feature Native Americans, Native American culture. She is not a Native American, so this is not an Own Voices, but her heart was in the right place, and she was using everything she had available to her to fight for the rights of the Native American people to not be disturbed, to not have their land taken. She wanted to protect their land. She wanted to protect their way of life. She wanted to let them advocate for themselves, but knew they did not have a voice. She, as a female, did not have much of a voice either. But remember, she was raised in the place where, and in the time when transcendentalism was the fad, and she believed in the rights of all people to govern themselves. And that's a lot of what this book was about. It is about Native Americans. It is about mixed heritage, a Latina heritage, and it takes place in California on the West Coast, and it blew me away. It's a love story. It's a beautiful love story. There's some problems in here. There's some problematic things, for sure. It's from 1884. Cut it some slack. It's beautiful, and it's heartbreaking and respectful and loving. That's what I'll say about it. Highly recommend it. I had never heard of it. One that I just read this year for the 1900 to 1950 project was A Town Like Alice. Again, problematic, some problematic elements having to do with casual racism, but racism is not a plot point in this book, so I do really, really support this book. It is one of the greatest pieces of storytelling I have ever read, and it is a love story like no other. It's also proto-feminist. I don't suggest you watch the 1980 TV movie. That will really just ruin all the things that are great about this book for you. But this is, I can't say anything without giving any spoilers, and I don't want to give any spoilers. The best way to go into this book is completely blind. Pick it up, just start reading. Like me, you will not be able to put it down. Amazing book. So there you have it. I love romances, but I love specific elements in romances. And Evvie Drake just wasn't it for me. It was nothing like any of the books that I absolutely love. It didn't have the natural dialogue. It didn't have the quirky factor. It didn't have humor. It didn't have genuine heartbreak-inducing storyline. It had a lot of self-flagellation. None of these books that I love have self-flagellation. It had a lot of guilt. It had like moving the story forward. It had a lot of combustible conversations between the two possible lovers. And while all of the books that I showed you do have some point where the characters, the two possible love interests, collide in some way in order to cause growth for one or both of those characters, none of them do that exclusively the way that Evvie Drake does. I just want to say that while Evvie Drake, a beloved in the Bookstagram community book and booktube community, while Evvie Drake is beloved, it was not beloved by me, but that doesn't mean I don't like romance. I love romance, and I have a lot of possible romances to recommend to you. So that's just me responding to me. about my own opinion. I hope that you found a book or two that you enjoyed, 1 or 2 romances that you can read that are of interest to you, from classics to contemporary to historical, to straight up romance to romance with a side of uber depth. I hope you found something that you might enjoy. I think summer is the time for romance. I know a lot of people focus on it in February. I don't care about February. I think summer is the time for romance. On that note, I will say goodbye until we meet again. Happy reading!